What's going on, guys? Welcome back to a brand new video. And today we're going to be talking about the new ESBC gameplay that we saw, and I'm going to be talking about the issues, some feedback, and in my opinion, the biggest problem that we saw from this gameplay. As you all know by now, creator's got 4.5 minutes of gameplay that we've shared and you guys have seen over and over again. I of course shared like a really high quality version of it on my channel, and people have been giving their thoughts, which has been great. Let me just say this, I know, trust me guys, I know that the game has issues. I know that there is fixes, balancing, changes to be made, but that is what they're constantly doing. I want to be talking about, guys, I'm going to be talking about, like I said, the biggest problem, some issues that you guys had and give my thoughts on them, as well as some context behind the gameplay itself, because I think people have seen this as a trailer, as a showcase, and I just want to cover a few things to get some context, which is what they really should have done in my opinion. So I'm going to jump into what I think the biggest problem was as an overhaul of showcasing this game. When you think of ESBC, you think of the hype, you think of finally a boxing game. However, in my opinion, the biggest issue was outside of the game itself. Now, I know that sounds stupid, but just hear me out for a second. Before I jump into the issues, the biggest problem was the game was being played poorly and like a spammer. They cannot be showing stuff like this, in my opinion. We're all waiting for gameplay. We're all waiting to see something, but instead we've seen an overhaul of crazy hooks being thrown. We're waiting to see this simulation game played in a simulation way. They need to show a pure round using the fighters correctly, not a bunch of uppercuts and hooks being thrown. It looks spammy and arcadey no matter the game. That's the problem. That's the sad reality of it. If you get into a game like Mortal Kombat and you just spam uppercuts, it looks more spammy than a technical Mortal Kombat fight. It's the same with any game. You get into UFC, people will now praise UFC all of a sudden. You throw nothing but hooks, it looks like a spammy Rocky Rumble game. That's just the way it is. And with the hype surrounding ESBC, if they really wanted to show the build that we used, they needed to show the build we used, how we played it, using the fighters to their truest forms and punishing any form of spam. I don't think this was a wise idea. I think the gameplay we got to see is brilliant. I think that it's great that they show us something, but I think it's a terrible idea with the hype surrounding it, with people nitpicking at every corner. They cannot use Rocky, Joe Lewis, Conor Benn, Arturo Gatti, Kell Brook in the same way. We saw very little real combination punching. We saw very little mixing up head, body, head. We didn't see none of that. It was all just flicking. It's not the right way to show the game. And before we jump into what your guys' issues were, let me just say, let's not forget, if this game drops in November, let's say, that's still just shy of 7 months for them to work on it. They have changed so much in 6 months. So let's not panic. Let's not act like we've been waiting 10 years for Steel City to drop this game. 2 years ago, there was no game. Remember that. And well, just over 2 years ago, there wasn't a game. So they've built it from the ground up to now a playable, solid product that is constantly having fixes done. Let's not forget, we could bag on other companies, but let's not forget that UFC 4, after 3 other games in 8 years, is still being shit on by its top of its community. Now, one thing I just want to cover, because this is one thing that's been annoying me, I'm not going to get into like the gripes of like how the community have been, but feedback is fantastic. I love feedback, but saying I knew it would be trash, that doesn't help anyone. Like, why would you not want a boxing game? I think it's a weird state that people have, and I hate to point fingers, but I think a lot of people in Discord have seen it is the UFC community. They just grab a random screenshot or a random 3 or 4 seconds and just show it, and it looks terrible. Why would you not want another boxing game? Why would you not want more combat sports video games out there? For example, credit to Martial Mind, he's always said that he'd love to have a variety: wrestling, jiu-jitsu, MMA, kickboxing, one championship, Bellator, ESBC, another boxing game. The more the merrier. I don't get this weird mentality that is like, let's just shit on it without offering anything. Let's not. I just don't get the mindset behind that when the game's only been in production for just over 2 years, and in that time has had a complete overhaul. I just don't get that. I think that's a really weird mentality to have when it comes to the love of combat sports, but just shitting on the only company that has tried in over a decade. Now, in terms of context for the gameplay, one thing to remember, guys, is this is a build that is maybe 1 or 2 months old. And from my understanding, that could be a small section from a certain build. A build is not always, as one of the developers explained, a build is not always a state of the game. This is the entire game. It could be a small window of a section of an old build of the game. I think this mentality of everyone suddenly understands how game creation works needs to stop. Because there is so much to it, and I know people will say, well, why show that then if it's a build, if it's not where it wants to be? I think we need to remember that this wasn't on the ESBC channel. This was them giving it to us so we could say, hey guys, look, this is the build that we played. And that's kind of it, this is the build we played, let's have a look at it. And like I said, it's tough to say, this is the build we played after I spent videos talking about the realism. This is the video we played, however, nothing like I played it. I didn't play like that in the slides. Nobody did. Anybody that threw 4 or 5 hooks in a row was gonna get their shit rocked and punished, but like I said, I'm not going to get into that part again, but I said at the start of the video, obviously. And of course, like obviously has been mentioned, it's still an alpha, there's still things to work on, we don't know where they're truly at, we don't know what they're showing, old or new, so that's always something to remember, as well as this constant thing that I feel like we have to be pointed out, is they're aiming for realism, but it's still a game. You can only expect so much. And, let's not act like current combat sports games are brilliant. We're in a shit situation with combat sports games. So it's still a game at the end of the day. And while I love realism and I'd love to control a real fight, it's not going to be like... There's things that need to be sacrificed in terms of video game aspects and vice versa, So some things maybe don't look visibly pleasing, but they make more sense in terms of gameplay. Now we're going to get into some of the complaints that I saw from you guys, as well as some issues that I have on it. The first one being is that the fighters were overly sweaty. This seemed like a nitpick, but what I realised that people mean, and they were just crying about things, was that the fighters are overly glossy. I 100% agree. The July gameplay had the much more... I don't know, would you say it's like saturation down, kind of like where it was a bit like, you could see the skin was drier, and later in the fight, yes, get a bit glossier in the 12 round, but it seemed they were very, very glossy, and that comes off as cartoonish and arcadey, and that's not something that we want at all. Another one I saw was that the crowd is not good. Come on, just grow up. No one cares. The crowd, yes, of course, is important, but how many games have we had? I mean, UFC 3 is an example. I know UFC 3 is a few years old now, but it had the same 5 characters after every single fight. One of them looked like a crowd version of Junior Dos Santos, just going, ugh. The crowd's the crowd. I feel like people are nitpicking because they don't want to like the game. Most sports games have pretty weak crowds, to be honest, that's the way it is. Yeah, let's hope that they have a more intuitive and reactive crowd, but that's not, I'm not going to be in my career and be like, oh, I hope the crowd reacts appropriately. That's not something that overly bothers me, if I'm honest. Now let's get into the actual problems. The first one being the punches aren't as fluid as they should be. Now to a point, this I agree with from what we've seen. Like I said, the biggest problem we're seeing are all these fighters are just swinging hooks and uppercuts, no effort being made to play well or string together proper combos, which gives off an arcadey vibe. Without a doubt, I will 100% agree. It's not a good look. However, I feel with the fluidity of the shots, people are so used to unreal trading, as in the sense that in a UFC game, you can stop most people's punches by hitting them first. That's not how it works. If you fight in real life, if you watch fighting, you see where people will always collide with 2 punches. They'll always jab at each other at the same time. There is none of that in this game. Once that animation is committed, you can obviously block and feint that and pull that back at any point. But if you commit with that animation and they commit, either both shots are going to land, neither are going to land, or one is going to land. And that's the way it should be. We should have that, where there isn't... that. I think that's why people are starting to say, the punches don't have as much power in. I'll get to that in a minute. But I think a lot of the time, people are seeing a jab land as well as a hook land, and they're seeing that and going, oh, those shots don't have power. They do, but if there's both shots landing at the same time, just doesn't mean you stop someone in their tracks immediately. That's not the way a real fight works. The next one I saw is the shots need more snap. I will agree. The jab, I think, looks good. I think that there is a few animation details with the jab that need to be changed. I think the straight is where it's lacking. And I mentioned this, if you guys remember, when I played the game, I come back and I made those videos, I mentioned the straight is lacking. The jab has a nice snap, but the straight is a bit like a wet noodle. We see it land with no snap. It doesn't push the head back. Like I said, I mentioned it in my video. We do need to see some hip rotation as well when throwing that solid straight. We see a lot of shoulder and rib cage movement as opposed to hip. We see the twisting of the foot as well as the shoulder, but we don't see much hip rotation in those straight shots. So I do agree that things like the straights definitely need that pop to them, the same as the jab has. Now the hooks. Now the hooks, I think, is one of the most debated things, and I will side with one side of the community here. One thing I want to point out is I've noticed that people will come in, and don't get me wrong, I know that everyone starts somewhere in boxing. I know that people know more than me, people know less than me, people know the same as me. I know that's the way the sport works, but one thing to constantly remember is very rarely do 2 fighters throw hooks the same. I think this idea of a textbook hook is what people are in the mindset of. We just look at a few fighters. Wilder White, Zora, Triple G, they all have that varied style of hooks, whether it be wild, jumping, twisting of the wrist more, a slightly more overhand style like Triple G. I think that's the problem. We're expecting this flawless textbook shot, and that's just not the way a real fight goes, a real hook goes. From what I've seen, the general consensus, and I'm on the side of this, is that the hooks look great. Even from a real nitpicker in the Discord, who goes by the name as Brandon, he was not a fan of the hooks for ages, and I feel like when you get someone that's been on the coattails of I don't like these hooks, I don't like these hooks, I don't like these hooks for so long, for them to finally turn around and say I like these hooks, that's when for me I'm like, okay, it's going in the right direction, because so many of the nitpickers from 12 months ago are now like, you know what, this looks good, however I still think this needs to be changed, and that's where I'm starting to think, okay, the consensus is now the hooks do look good. And I 100% agree. I think the hooks look great. I think maybe they need a bit more snap. They maybe need to stop running through the head. I noticed that they land and they run through the head instead of cracking and coming back, perhaps. But other than that, I think the hooks look great. Now, of course, we have animations like we're throwing the jab or throwing the straight, like tucking the chin. We don't see a lot of that here. This is something that would definitely help with that real boxing experience. It also is another way of helping keep your fighter safe when they throw those shots. So say if you throw your jab and someone throws the hook, it will hit your shoulder as opposed to just going over your shoulder and hitting that chin. However, like I mentioned with the hooks, they're both being used nicely from the inside and from range. They both land well. I don't have an issue with either of those. I just think those little animations like tucking the chin, twisting the hips need to be helped. We also have things like weaving and upper body movement being slow. I've already mentioned that in a video. I spoke about it after I played. That's one thing that I've mentioned again and again and again. Now, the next one I want to get onto is this robotic argument. Now, sometimes I notice that people in a certain community will say something and everyone just runs with it. People don't offer a reason to why. I noticed that some people will say, it looks like this because of A, B, C, and D, which I love. People just go, it looks like this because it does. I don't believe you. That's just the way it is. I don't believe that people... I know not everyone has to justify their reasons, but I think people just carry a bandwagon of opinions led by someone who's popular in a certain community. But one thing I want to point out for the robotic argument is, given that the punches are varied animations depending on where you throw them, for example, moving backwards, moving forward, moving to the side, I'm interested to know where this robotic thing comes from, because surely robotic would be the same animation over and over and over again. Or what I'm thinking is people are saying this based on the speed, because you could argue that the punches do need to be a tad bit faster. I don't want rapid combinations. Fight Night, their uppercuts and hooks are way too quick. You can string together 6 or 7, 8 or 9 or 10 uppercuts and hooks in a row with no speed issues. Fighters do not fight like that often, whereas you can do at any point throughout the fight, which I'm just not a fan of. If it was me, I would say they need to increase the speed of the punches by 10 to 15% for shots while walking forward, while, you know, your feet are planted. Of course, you can't maintain that speed all the time while moving sideways or backwards, but I'd like to see that faster combination as opposed to this. I feel like what they've done with slowing it down is they've given... they've given everyone the opportunity to move out the way of the shots. I would much rather us as players have to learn, okay, you know, pick up on what this player is doing, predict what they're doing as they move. Because like I said, because there's no tracked animation, you can dodge at any point of this jab. You can dodge, 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 dodge. You can dodge until it's here, and you can do that. And that's the way it should be. I do agree the punches need to be a bit faster, because when the hook, when you're like, you know, you'll jab, jab, and you'll see this big hook coming, you want it to go like this. You don't want it to go like this. And that's part of the problem, is we're seeing lots of this, and it just doesn't look good for the game. As I mentioned, it does not look good at all. It looks terrible. We need to... that they need, if next time they need to, if there's developers that don't have the time to play the game like that, then bring in like Sonny Edwards. He's played the game a shit ton. He knows how to box. Bring him in and let him record the footage, and that's what we need to see, in my opinion. Another one is the sound. I agree. Some sound great. However, some sound not so great, a little bit disappointing. I hate to use the wet noodle analogy again, but they sound a little bit like a wet noodle slap on a wall. They just... Some of them don't sound great. Some sound, you know, some sound good, I'll be honest. But some of the punches, they definitely sound a bit cardboardy. So I do agree with that point as well. Like I said, guys, the last thing I want to point out is there is no tracking. There really isn't. You need to make sure you're in range with that shot, which is why you see things like the jabs miss. The overall biggest problem, like I said, and like I said at the start of the video, and I'll say it again now, is they really didn't play the game to its fullest potential. I think that they've really... I appreciate this wasn't a trailer, this wasn't a showcase, but I think that that was the problem, is people wanted to see Joe Louis and Rocky Marciano fight. They want to see Rocky weaving to get on the inside. Joe Louis pushing out that jab, bang, bang, pushing out that jab to snap his head back. 1-2 as Rocky's coming in. The 2, of course, lacks that snap, but if we saw a bit more of that, people would be able to go, you know what, actually, the fluidity of the fighting goes nicely. However, that straight, that 2, that needs more snapping out. Fair enough. So I think that's the biggest problem. Of course, you know, the game is still in that alpha state, like I mentioned. We don't know where they're at in builds and all this shit. It is so many variables to it. But I think... You know, I think a lot of it, you can tell people are stuck in seeing the same animations over and over again. You know, from where it's just the same hook. Everybody throws the same perfect hook. And don't get me wrong, UFC striking is decent, but it is the same animations. Unless you have the Celtic cross or the snap jab, everybody's got the same jab, the same hook. Whereas it's not like this. That they've used a lot of fighters that maybe fight relatively basic. Ben and Gatti, they don't have super unique animations. They should have shown Fury, because then we would have seen his little hop and that little snap, as opposed to just this jab, just this real strict jab. So there's things they could have done differently. I of course want the game to be brilliant. I'm not going to sit here and say it's brilliant. How dare you guys say bad words about it. I'm on the side of you guys. I want the game to be brilliant, but like I said, the mindless hate, it doesn't make sense to me. Let's you know, let's want a new boxing game. We want it. Who else is doing it? People say, "I'll wait for EA." Then fuck off. You'll be waiting years. It's not going to happen. They're not going to do it. They've got a 10-year contract with UFC. You think they're going to get rid of half their team? They could barely make a good game with a full team. You think they're going to get rid of half their team to make a piss poor fight night? It's not going to happen. So let's support the boxing game that is coming. But that's my thoughts on that, guys. Like I said, don't think that I'm just going to agree with everything they do. I will always give my feedback, my criticism. Just because I enjoy the gameplay and I break it down in a positive manner doesn't mean that I don't see the flaws with it. I think that's one thing to point out. But yeah, I just thought I'd just make this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. And I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.